After losing her husband of nearly 50 years, Mrs. Amelia Grant found herself in a state of quiet mourning. She was a woman who had spent decades holding her family together, building a life alongside her late husband in a small southern town where every neighbor knew each other's names. Her son, Lawrence, had suggested she move to Chicago to live with him and his family, assuring her that they would take care of her and that her presence would be a joy. The invitation sounded like the right choice, a way to escape the solitude and heavy quiet that had settled into her home since her husband's passing. When Amelia stepped off the bus and into the brisk Chicago air, she took in the city skyline with a mix of wonder and apprehension. Her son had arranged for a driver to pick her up and bring her to his suburban home, a far cry from the cozy, familiar town she had left behind. She wore her Sunday best, dark wool coat, wide-brimmed hat, and the thin pearl necklace her husband had given her decades ago. She wanted to make a good impression, believing that this new life would require all the grace she could muster. Arriving at Lawrence's house, a large, modern home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, Amelia couldn't help but notice the size and polished appearance of it. Unlike her quaint, single-story home, everything here seemed spotless, almost sterile, with a sprawling lawn and meticulously trimmed bushes lining the driveway. She clutched her small handbag a bit tighter, taking a breath as the front door opened to reveal her son and his wife, Sarah. "Mom," Lawrence greeted, moving forward to hug her. His embrace was familiar but quick, as if distracted. "It's good to see you." He offered her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good to see you too, honey," Amelia replied, patting his arm. She glanced over at Sarah, who stood just behind him, her expression polite but reserved. "Hi, Amelia," Sarah said, her voice cool as she nodded. "Welcome to Chicago." "Thank you, Sarah," Amelia replied, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. As they moved inside, Amelia noticed the minimalist decor and the almost clinical cleanliness of the house. No photographs adorned the walls, no knickknacks or personal touches gave warmth to the space. She felt a pang, missing the clutter and memories that filled her own home. Lawrence helped Amelia carry her bags to the small guest room near the back of the house. "This will be your room, Mom. I know it's not the biggest, but you'll have privacy here," he explained, as if anticipating a complaint. Amelia smiled faintly, setting her suitcase on the bed. "It's lovely, thank you," she said softly, though she felt a slight ache as she took in the unfamiliar space. "Well, we'll let you get settled," Sarah added briskly from the doorway. "Dinner's at 7?" As Lawrence and Sarah left her to unpack, Amelia looked around, feeling the weight of the transition settling in. She sat on the edge of the bed, gazing out the small window to the backyard, wondering if this new chapter would indeed bring the comfort and closeness she longed for, or if it would leave her feeling more isolated than ever. As evening approached, Amelia made her way to the dining room, taking careful steps down the long, quiet hallway. She could hear faint murmurs coming from the kitchen, voices low and distant. When she reached the dining room, Sarah was already setting the table with precise movements, placing each piece of cutlery in perfect alignment. Amelia took a seat, folding her hands in her lap and offering a warm smile as Sarah glanced up. "Can I help with anything, Sarah?" Amelia asked, eager to find some way to make herself useful. Sarah paused, her expression tight. "No, everything's under control, thanks," she replied, her tone polite but dismissive. She looked at Amelia for a moment, her gaze appraising, as if measuring Amelia's presence against some invisible standard. Just then, Lawrence entered, carrying a dish of roasted vegetables. "Dinner's ready," he announced, his voice cheerful but a bit forced. He placed the dish in the center of the table, and shortly after, their children, Peter and Lucy, shuffled in, each muttering a half-hearted hello as they took their seats. Amelia greeted them warmly, but the children barely acknowledged her, their eyes fixed on their phones or the food. Dinner began with an uncomfortable silence, interrupted only by the clinking of silverware. Amelia tried to break the tension, looking at Peter with a gentle smile. "So, Peter, how's school going? Any interesting subjects this year?" Peter glanced up briefly, giving a slight shrug. "It's fine, I guess," he muttered before turning back to his phone. "Lucy," Amelia tried, shifting her gaze to her granddaughter. You still into art? I remember your dad mentioning you like to paint. Lucy looked up, rolling her eyes slightly. That was like years ago, she said with a sigh. I don't really have time for that stuff anymore. Amelia's smile faltered, and she glanced toward Lawrence, hoping he might step in to bridge the gap. But Lawrence was busy checking a work email, and Sarah sat across from her with a slight frown, watching the interaction with barely concealed impatience. Amelia, Sarah said after a moment, her voice cutting through the silence. I know this is all new for you, but things are a bit different here. We have a certain routine, and it's important we keep things running smoothly. Her tone was measured, but had an edge that didn't go unnoticed. Amelia nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around her fork. I understand, dear. I'll do my best to fit in and not disrupt anything. Sarah gave a quick nod, as if the conversation was already over. Good. I'm sure it'll be an adjustment for everyone, but I'm sure you'll find your place here. Amelia forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. I'll do my best to make myself useful. Back home, family dinners were always a big part of our evenings. I could help with cooking or setting up if you ever need it. That's kind, but our routine works well for us as it is, Sarah replied curtly. We don't usually need much help. A painful silence followed, and Amelia felt herself sinking into her seat, feeling as though she'd taken up too much space just by being there. As the evening wore on, she felt increasingly like an outsider in her own son's home, the warmth and acceptance she had hoped for seeming further away than ever. She focused on her plate, picking at the food in silence as her mind drifted to memories of home, of laughter, of shared stories, of hands reaching across the table to comfort and connect. After dinner, as the children disappeared to their rooms and Lawrence returned to his laptop, Amelia lingered at the table, looking at Sarah with a gentle smile. Thank you for the meal, Sarah. It was lovely. Sarah barely looked up as she began clearing the table. I'll take care of the dishes. You can rest, she said shortly, almost as if dismissing Amelia from the room. Amelia nodded, feeling the sting of the distance between them, and quietly retreated to her room. Closing the door softly behind her, she took a deep breath and sat on the bed, gazing at the bare walls. It was a world apart from the lively, picture-filled home she had known. As she looked out the small window, she couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever truly feel at home here, or if she'd always remain an outsider in her son's life. In the days that followed, Amelia worked hard to settle into the rhythms of her new home, though it was clear that every small step required patience and a willingness to adapt. Each morning, she rose early, slipping quietly down the hall to avoid disturbing the family. She had always been an early riser, enjoying the quiet hours to herself, but here, her steps felt heavier, her presence somehow intrusive in the sterile, sprawling house that felt more like a showroom than a home. The guest room they'd given her was small, yet meticulously organized, painted in soft gray tones that felt more utilitarian than welcoming. The bedspread was a crisp white, devoid of the warmth of any personal touches. She tried to soften the space by placing a few small items on the bedside table, a framed photo of her late husband, a small lace doily her grandmother had made. But each time she glanced around, the room still felt foreign, as if she were merely visiting a hotel instead of moving into her son's home. One afternoon, as she folded laundry in the guest room, she heard footsteps approaching. Sarah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression neutral but her eyes scanning the room. I just wanted to check in, Sarah said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. How are you adjusting, Amelia? Everything comfortable? Amelia smiled, trying to ease the tension. Yes, everything is fine. I appreciate all you've done to make me feel at home. She gestured to the photo on the nightstand. I just brought a few things from home, to keep close to my heart. Sarah's gaze flicked to the photograph and the doily, her brow slightly furrowing. I see, she said, her tone polite but cool. I don't mean to intrude, but I'd like to keep things as streamlined as possible around here. We try to keep personal items confined to private spaces. It's just how we do things in our home. She smiled again, this time tighter. Oh, of course. I wouldn't want to disturb the flow of things, Amelia replied, feeling a pang as she looked at the picture. She'd hoped that bringing a piece of her past would give her comfort, but now she was beginning to wonder if even these small tokens were too much in Sarah's eyes. Later, Amelia attempted to help with the daily chores, but her offers were frequently turned down by Sarah. Each time she offered to fold the laundry, prepare dinner, or tidy up, Sarah would shake her head gently and say, "I've got it covered. Just relax and enjoy your time here." Though the words sounded kind, Amelia sensed an underlying tone that made her feel more like a guest than family, as if she were somehow a disruption to the smooth, efficient household that Sarah so meticulously maintained. On another afternoon, Amelia decided to bring a bit of her old life into the house by cooking a pot of gumbo, a recipe passed down from her mother and one she used to make regularly back home. She hoped it might be a way to connect, to offer her family a taste of her culture and memories. As the savory aroma filled the kitchen, Amelia felt a bit of the weight lift from her shoulders, smiling as she stirred the pot and thought of home. However, when Sarah walked in, her face fell slightly. "Oh, I didn't know you were cooking," she said, a hint of displeasure in her voice. "I already planned dinner for tonight. We're having pasta." Amelia's face softened, a flicker of embarrassment crossing her expression. "I'm so sorry, dear. I didn't mean to interfere. I just thought I wanted to make something special for everyone." Sarah sighed, though she tried to hide it. "It's fine, Amelia. But next time, could you maybe let me know? I like to keep things organized around here." The words stung, and Amelia swallowed the lump in her throat, nodding with a gentle smile. "Of course, Sarah. I didn't mean to step on any toes." As Sarah left the kitchen, Amelia turned back to the gumbo, stirring it slowly, the once comforting smell now tinged with a bitter sense of rejection. The recipe, so steeped in memories of laughter and shared meals, seemed out of place here, in a house where everything felt calculated and constrained. She ladled a small bowl for herself, bringing it back to her room and sitting in silence, eating slowly, savoring the taste of home as best as she could in a place that felt increasingly cold and distant. In those quiet moments, Amelia thought about the expectations she had when she first arrived, how she'd envisioned family gatherings filled with warmth and laughter, and a home where she could share her stories, her love, and her traditions. Yet, with each day that passed, it became clear that her son's life had taken on a shape that left little room for her own. She felt herself retreating inward, wondering if she'd ever truly find a place in this house that felt more and more like a stranger's. Amelia had always imagined her grandchildren would be the light in her new life. She had eagerly anticipated sharing stories with them, introducing them to the culture and traditions she held dear, and watching them grow up close to her heart. But Peter and Lucy, teenagers immersed in their digital worlds, proved harder to reach than she'd expected. Both children were often engrossed in their screens, headphones on, only occasionally lifting their heads to acknowledge anyone else in the room. Amelia missed the days when family time meant actual connection and conversation rather than silent coexistence. One Saturday afternoon, Amelia decided to take a gentle approach and try to get to know her grandchildren better. She noticed Peter sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone with a blank expression. She gathered her courage and sat down beside him, hoping to spark a conversation. "Peter," she began softly, "I was thinking, maybe one day we could cook something together. I could teach you a recipe my mother taught me. Something special from back home." Peter gave a slight nod without looking up, his thumbs tapping at the screen. "Sure," he mumbled, though his tone was flat and disinterested. Amelia took a breath, trying not to let his indifference dampen her spirits. She turned to Lucy, who was walking through the room with her tablet in hand. "Lucy, maybe you'd like to try it too? We could have some fun cooking together. I even have a few stories I could tell you about the recipes, where they came from and all." Lucy paused, her face scrunching slightly. "I'm kinda busy, Grandma," she replied, looking away. "I don't really cook. I'd probably mess it up anyway." Amelia felt the pang of disappointment settle deeper, but she forced a small smile. "You know, I used to think the same thing when I was young. But my mom taught me, just as I'd like to teach you. Cooking's not as hard as it seems. It's just a matter of heart and patience." Peter let out a sigh, his eyes finally meeting hers. "Grandma, it's just different here," he said, his tone bordering on impatience. "We don't really do that kind of stuff. And besides, I don't think we even have the ingredients you'd need." Amelia's smile faded. "I see," she said softly, glancing down. "Well, maybe another time, then." She wanted to reach out, to create even the smallest bond, but it was as if an invisible wall separated her from them, a barrier built from years of different experiences and expectations. When Lawrence entered the room, she looked up hopefully, thinking he might encourage the children to take an interest, to engage even briefly. But he merely glanced between them and returned to his phone, preoccupied with emails and messages that seemed, in his mind, to hold more importance than family time. Feeling the weight of rejection, Amelia sat in silence, watching her grandchildren drift back into their virtual worlds. A sense of loneliness crept in, stronger now as she realized the growing gap between her and the family she had hoped would offer a sanctuary from her solitude. Later that evening, she attempted once more, joining them in the living room as they watched a movie. She settled into a chair nearby, hoping that shared space would lead to shared moments, but the distance between them remained. The children were absorbed in their own thoughts, laughing at jokes she didn't understand and making references to things that seemed like a foreign language. The next day, Amelia overheard Sarah speaking to Lawrence in the kitchen, her voice low but sharp. "She's trying too hard, Lawrence," Sarah murmured. "The kids aren't used to this. She needs to understand that they have their own routines. She's just trying to be involved," Lawrence replied, though there was a hint of frustration in his tone as well. "Maybe give her a chance?" Sarah sighed. "I am, but this isn't a visit. She's living with us now. There needs to be boundaries." Amelia stood frozen in the hallway, her heart heavy as she listened. She hadn't realized her efforts were seen as intrusive, her presence something to be tolerated rather than embraced. She returned to her room, closing the door quietly behind her, feeling a sadness that settled deep in her bones. The family she had come to be close to felt more distant than ever, her efforts to connect seeming only to push them further away. In the following days, she tried to keep to herself, retreating into her room to avoid the tension that seemed to arise whenever she ventured out. Her heart ached for the bond she longed to create with her grandchildren, but with each small rejection, she felt herself withdrawing, finding solace in memories of her old life. A life filled with laughter, shared meals, and unconditional love. Despite the chilly atmosphere, Amelia wasn't one to give up easily. She clung to the hope that, with time and patience, she might bridge the gap between her and her family. In her heart, she knew that relationships could be fragile, needing care and persistence to flourish. With this in mind, she looked for small ways to connect with them, finding moments here and there to share glimpses of her past and the values she held close. One morning, Amelia woke up early and decided to prepare breakfast for the family. She wanted to surprise them with a Southern-style spread, grits, homemade biscuits, and scrambled eggs, dishes she'd perfected over the years. As she bustled around the kitchen, she hummed an old gospel tune, filling the quiet house with a warmth she dearly missed. The smell of cooking drew Lawrence down to the kitchen first. He blinked, surprised, as he took in the sight of his mother moving confidently around the space, her apron slightly dusted with flour. "Good morning, Mom," he said, his voice tinged with both surprise and appreciation. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "Oh, it's no trouble at all," Amelia replied, her smile genuine as she slid a plate toward him. "Just thought I'd make breakfast for everyone. Nothing like a good meal to start the day." Lawrence looked at the food, then back at her, a hint of nostalgia crossing his face. "It smells just like home," he murmured, and for a moment, Amelia felt a glimmer of connection. She had hoped her cooking might bring a bit of her world into theirs, to remind them of the simpler times they once shared. But as the rest of the family joined them, the mood shifted. Sarah walked into the kitchen, her gaze moving from the spread of food to Amelia, her expression controlled. "Oh, you made breakfast," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "I usually just make smoothies for everyone. This is a lot. I thought I'd surprise everyone," Amelia replied, trying to keep her voice light. "I figured a hearty meal could be a nice change." Sarah nodded, though her expression didn't soften. She glanced at Lawrence, who was already halfway through his plate, but the children looked at the food uncertainly, as though unsure what to make of it. Peter poked at his grits with a fork, wrinkling his nose. "What's this stuff?" "They're grits," Amelia explained patiently. "They're kind of like oatmeal, but we eat them savory down south." Lucy eyed her biscuit, then looked at her mother. "Mom, can I have my smoothie instead?" Sarah gave a small, approving nod. "Of course, honey. You're not used to this kind of breakfast." The disappointment hit Amelia like a blow. She watched as Peter set his plate aside and Lucy sipped her smoothie, a part of her aching as she saw her gesture so casually dismissed. Lawrence, sensing the tension, tried to bridge the gap. "Mom's right," he said, his voice gentle but strained. "This kind of breakfast reminds me of when I was a kid. It's really good." Amelia looked at him, grateful for the attempt, but the sting remained. Her heart sank as she realized that her efforts to share a part of herself were seen as strange, something to be tolerated but not truly welcomed. Her mind drifted back to her kitchen back home, where meals were a time of connection, a way to express love and care. Later that day, Amelia retreated to her room, feeling the weight of rejection settle deeper. She began placing more of her treasured belongings around the space. Small figurines, her husband's old pocket watch, a photo album filled with memories of family gatherings and Sunday dinners. She arranged each item carefully, hoping to create a little sanctuary within the unfamiliar walls, a place where she could feel grounded in the life she'd left behind. When Sarah came by to check on her that evening, her eyes fell on the decorations with an unreadable expression. She looked at the pocket watch, the framed family photo, and the woven cloth draped across the dresser, her brow furrowing slightly. "Amelia," she said, her voice restrained, "I know you're trying to make yourself at home, but we don't usually keep personal items like this out in the open. It's just the way we keep things here." Amelia's face softened with a hint of sadness. "I understand, Sarah. It's just, these things remind me of home, of my husband, of my family. They bring me comfort." Sarah sighed, crossing her arms. "I get that, but we need to keep the house uncluttered, for everyone's comfort. You know how Lawrence and I are with the kids' routines and all." Amelia nodded slowly, the rejection deepening. "Of course, dear," she murmured. "I'll keep them out of sight." After Sarah left, Amelia gathered her cherished belongings and carefully tucked them back into a drawer, as though hiding away pieces of herself. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the now-bare dresser, feeling as if each item she stored away took another piece of her with it. In the quiet of her room, Amelia grappled with a growing loneliness, one that felt more profound than anything she'd ever known. She had come here with the hope of finding connection, warmth, and family, only to feel like an outsider in her own son's home. As she sat in silence, the walls around her seemed to close in, turning the once promising house into a reminder of everything she'd lost and everything she couldn't seem to reach. As the days turned into weeks, Amelia's sense of isolation only deepened. The initial hope she'd carried, the belief that her family would provide warmth and comfort during this new stage of her life, had faded, replaced by a gnawing ache of loneliness. The small acts of exclusion, whether intentional or not, seemed to pile up, leaving her feeling invisible. Even her attempts to connect, to bring pieces of herself into their lives, were met with polite indifference or outright dismissal. One gray afternoon, Amelia found herself confined to her small guest room, the sounds of the bustling household muffled by the walls that now felt like barriers. She sat in the soft, muted light filtering through the window, a faded picture of her late husband in her hands. She traced her fingers over the worn edges of the photo, her mind drifting to the life they had shared. They had built their world together with laughter, love, and resilience. One that was rich with the memories of family gatherings, shared meals, and the simple warmth of familiar routines. Looking around the impersonal guest room, she felt a wave of nostalgia for her old home. Back in the South, her days were filled with comforting rituals. Each morning, she would walk to the local market, exchanging greetings with neighbors who had known her for decades. She would pick out fresh produce and chat with familiar faces, the rhythm of the day woven into the fabric of her life. Her evenings had been spent in the cozy glow of her own kitchen, surrounded by photos and trinkets that carried memories of her children's early years, of her late husband's laughter echoing through the rooms. Here, those cherished memories felt distant, almost like echoes of a life that had slipped through her fingers. Even her small attempts to recreate a sense of home, like decorating her room with the few sentimental items she'd brought, were met with disapproval. It seemed that, with each reminder of her past that she tried to preserve, she was met with a subtle reminder that her world didn't fit into this one. One evening, Lawrence stopped by her room. "Mom," he began, his tone hesitant. "Sarah told me she spoke to you about the decorations." He glanced at the few items she had left out, his expression a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. "You know she means well. She's just trying to keep things organized." Amelia forced a gentle smile, though her heart ached. "I understand, Lawrence. I know she likes things a certain way." She paused, choosing her words carefully. These little things are reminders of home. They help me feel like I still have a piece of my life with me." Lawrence shifted awkwardly, as though uncertain how to respond. "I know, Mom, but this is a new place, and maybe it's time to let go of some of those old things. You know, embrace a fresh start." The words, though said gently, hit her like a blow. She had always thought of home as something permanent, a foundation that held her family together. Letting go of that felt like letting go of a part of herself, of her very identity. After Lawrence left, Amelia sat alone, the silence pressing in around her. She pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal she had kept for years, filled with small notes and memories of her life, of her late husband, and of the family she had once thought she would be a part of forever. She ran her fingers over the pages, feeling a sense of comfort in the familiar words, a reminder that her life had been full of meaning, of love, even if it now seemed distant. As the evening wore on, she found herself replaying memories from her past. Christmases spent with family gathered around a crowded table, Sunday mornings filled with laughter as her husband read the newspaper aloud, the warmth of a community that had embraced her with open arms. Each memory was like a gentle reminder of everything she had once held dear, everything that seemed to slip further away with each passing day in her son's home. In those quiet moments, Amelia began to realize that the loneliness she felt wasn't just about being physically alone. It was about the loss of connection to her own identity, to the life she had built, and to the values she had carried for so long. The house she was now confined to felt like a world apart from the one she had known, a place where her history, her traditions, and her very sense of self seemed to have no place. With a heavy heart, Amelia returned the journal to her drawer, her mind swirling with thoughts of home, of the life she had left behind, and of the uncertain path that lay ahead. She wondered if this was what the rest of her days would look like, a quiet, unseen presence in a house that had no room for her memories, no place for her heart. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, she felt the weight of her solitude more acutely than ever, the echoes of her past the only comfort in the growing silence around her. The following week, Amelia decided she would try, one last time, to bring a piece of her past into her present, hoping that the small touches of familiarity might give her a sense of peace in her son's home. She gathered a few items she kept tucked away, a small photo album, rosary given to her by her mother, and a quilt her grandmother had made, stitched with the stories of generations past. She spread the quilt over her bed, the vibrant colors and worn patches a stark contrast to the monochromatic decor that defined the rest of the house. The quilt, a simple yet powerful link to her roots, brought her a sense of comfort she had missed terribly. Sitting on the bed, she opened the photo album, running her fingers over the pictures, her heart warmed by the memories they held. Images of family gatherings, holiday dinners, and sunlit afternoons in the garden filled her with a bittersweet nostalgia. These small reminders of her life before Chicago were like anchors, tethering her to the parts of herself that felt lost in this new, unwelcoming environment. Later that day, Sarah entered the guest room, her gaze sweeping over the quilt and the open album. She took a deep breath, her expression neutral but her stance clearly defensive. "Amelia," she began, her voice carefully measured, "I thought we'd agreed on keeping the room uncluttered." Amelia looked up, her face softening with a quiet resolve. "I know, Sarah. and I appreciate everything you've done to make me feel comfortable here. But these things, they're all I have left of home. They remind me of who I am." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting from the quilt to the rosary on the bedside table. "It's just that. We like to keep things organized here. Too many personal items disrupt the flow of the house. I don't mean to sound harsh, but it's important to us to maintain a certain order." Amelia swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "I understand that, Sarah. I do. But these items, they're not just decorations. They're memories. They remind me of my family, of where I come from, of my husband." Her voice softened further, a hint of pleading in her tone. "I've lost so much already. These small things, they help me feel grounded." Sarah sighed, visibly torn, but her gaze remained firm. "I get that, Amelia, but this is our home, and we have our own way of doing things. I need you to respect that." She gave a small, tight smile before adding, "Maybe you could keep the album and quilt stored away, just so everything remains tidy." Amelia looked down, a pang of sadness settling in her chest as she began to fold the quilt. She could feel the weight of each stitch, each memory woven into the fabric, slipping away as she tucked it back into the drawer. The items she'd hoped would bring her solace had instead become symbols of the growing divide between her and the family she'd come to be close to. That evening, as Amelia sat alone in her room, the sense of loss felt heavier than ever. Her few remaining personal effects were now hidden from view, tucked away in a house that seemed to have no room for her memories or the life she had once known. She realized then that it wasn't just her belongings Sarah wanted to keep out of sight. It was everything they represented, her past, her traditions, and the culture she'd hoped to share. Lawrence stopped by her room later, sensing the sadness etched into his mother's face. "Mom," he said softly, pulling up a chair beside her, "I know this hasn't been easy for you, and I want you to feel comfortable here. I really do." Amelia looked at him, her eyes reflecting both love and disappointment. "Lawrence, I just wanted to bring a part of my life with me, to feel connected to something familiar. This is all new to me, and it's hard to feel at home when I'm asked to put away everything that reminds me of who I am." Lawrence sighed, glancing at the closed drawer where the quilt and photo album were stored. "I understand, Mom, but Sarah's very particular about how we keep things here. Maybe with time, things will get easier." Amelia nodded, though a part of her knew that time alone wouldn't bridge the gap. She placed a hand on Lawrence's arm, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "I just hope you remember, Lawrence, that family isn't about keeping things tidy or perfect. It's about love, about sharing our lives with each other. Even the messy parts." Lawrence looked away, his expression conflicted, and after a brief pause, he excused himself, leaving Amelia alone once more. She sat in silence, the words she had hoped would reach him hanging in the air, unanswered. That night, as Amelia lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind filled with thoughts of home. The life she had known felt like a distant dream, a world where love and connection had been tangible, not hidden away in drawers and closets. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, she wondered if she would ever find a place in her son's home, or if she would remain forever on the periphery, a silent witness to a family she could only observe from afar. As the days wore on, tension between Amelia and Sarah became a quiet undercurrent, a steady presence that surfaced in brief, pointed exchanges or subtle looks. Amelia tried to stay out of Sarah's way, conscious of the discomfort her presence seemed to bring. But it was impossible to ignore the friction building beneath the surface, the unspoken divide between them widening each day. One morning, after another silent breakfast where the family seemed more absorbed in their routines than each other, Amelia waited until Lawrence left for work and the children went off to school. She found Sarah in the kitchen, cleaning up with her usual efficient, brisk manner. Amelia took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she prepared to finally speak the words that had been sitting heavily on her chest. "Sarah," she began softly, her voice both steady and vulnerable, "I want to talk about something that's been on my mind. I know I'm not the easiest person to have around, and I appreciate all you've done to make me feel welcome here. But I can't help but feel, I don't know if I truly belong." Sarah glanced up, her expression carefully neutral, though a flicker of surprise passed over her face. She put down the dishcloth, crossing her arms as she faced Amelia. "Amelia," she replied, choosing her words with care, "I understand that this has been an adjustment for you, and I know it's not easy. But you have to understand, Lawrence and I have our own way of doing things. We have routines that work for us, and sometimes, it feels like you're trying to bring your old life into ours." Amelia's heart ached at the words, but she nodded, keeping her composure. "I know my ways may seem different to you, Sarah, but it's not about changing your routines or disrupting your lives. It's about wanting to feel part of this family, wanting to share a little of who I am." Sarah's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained firm. "It's just, sometimes it feels like there's an expectation that we have to change everything to accommodate you. The kids aren't used to having someone here all the time, and I'm not used to adjusting my routines." She hesitated, then added, "We're just very different, Amelia." Amelia took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of hurt and determination. "Yes, we are different, Sarah, but family is supposed to bring different people together, isn't it? My traditions, my past, those are part of who I am. I thought maybe, just maybe, sharing them would be a way to build something together." Sarah looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "It's not that I don't respect where you come from," she said finally, "but Lawrence and I have worked hard to create a balanced environment for our kids. It's just not easy for them. Or for me." A heavy silence fell between them, and Amelia sensed that her words had struck a chord, though Sarah's expression remained guarded. She felt the weight of her hopes dwindling, the reality of the divide between them settling like a stone in her heart. "I understand, Sarah," Amelia replied, her voice soft. "I never meant to make things harder. I just thought family was about finding a way to blend our lives, to make room for each other." Sarah gave a tight smile, her voice carefully controlled. "We appreciate you being here, Amelia. I know Lawrence loves having you close. It's just, everyone needs time to adjust." Amelia nodded, though the words felt empty. She realized that, despite her efforts, she might never truly fit into this family, not in the way she had hoped. Her presence was tolerated, but not truly welcomed, a delicate balance of politeness that only underscored the distance between her and the life she had entered. As Sarah turned back to her tasks, Amelia quietly retreated to her room, her heart heavy. She felt the familiar loneliness settle over her, a quiet resignation taking the place of her hopes for connection. It was as though the house had closed in on her, its walls confining her to a space where her memories, her traditions, and her love had no place. In the solitude of her room, Amelia sat beside the small chest where she had tucked away her belongings, each item a reminder of the life she'd left behind. She pulled out her photo album, running her fingers over the images of her husband, her old home, and the friends and family who had once been her world. She felt a bittersweet ache as she turned each page, the faces in the photographs reminding her of the closeness and warmth she had once known. The confrontation with Sarah replayed in her mind, each word a reminder that her presence here was conditional, a courtesy rather than a true embrace. Amelia realized that, while she might be able to stay in her son's home, her spirit was adrift, her place in the family no more secure than a guest passing through. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind turned to the memories of her old life, a life filled with connection and love. She felt a surge of longing, not only for her husband and her friends, but for the sense of belonging she had once taken for granted. The realization settled over her like a quiet truth. Family, she thought, wasn't just about being under the same roof. It was about sharing your heart, opening your life, and welcoming each other, flaws and all. And in the silence of that night, Amelia found herself wondering if she would ever truly find a place in her son's life, or if she would remain forever a visitor, a reminder of a past that had no place in the world they had built. The next evening, as the house grew quiet and the children were busy with homework, Lawrence knocked softly on Amelia's door. She looked up from her knitting, a small smile brightening her face as he entered. She had been hoping for a moment alone with him, a chance to talk openly, away from the watchful gaze of Sarah and the children. "Hi, Mom," Lawrence greeted, sitting beside her on the small armchair near her bed. He looked tired, his face lined with the stresses of work and family life. "I wanted to check in on you. It seems, I don't know, like things have been a little tense around here lately." Amelia studied her son's face, the familiar features softened by concern. She took a breath, deciding it was time to be honest, to share the feelings she kept quietly to herself for weeks. "Lawrence," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "I appreciate you inviting me here, letting me stay with you. I know it's not easy to make space for someone new in your home." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I feel like I'm a stranger here, not part of the family." Lawrence's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt and discomfort passing over his face. He looked down at his hands, fidgeting slightly. "Mom, it's just, things are different now. Sarah and I have a certain way of doing things, routines that work for us and the kids. It's been an adjustment for everyone, and maybe we didn't prepare well enough for that." Amelia nodded, her voice soft. "I understand that, Lawrence. I don't expect everything to be like it was in my old home, but I thought that maybe we could find a way to meet in the middle, to share a bit of our lives with each other." Her voice trembled slightly as she added, "I came here because I wanted to be close to you, to be part of your life. I don't want to feel like I'm just intruding." Lawrence looked up, his eyes softening. "You're not intruding, Mom. Your family, and I love having you close. But Sarah and we have a lot on our plates. The kids, work, the demands of keeping everything in balance." He hesitated, his tone both apologetic and resigned. "It's hard to fit everything in." Amelia reached out, placing a hand on his. "I know life is busy, Lawrence, and I'm not asking for much. I just want a little space to be myself, to feel like I can bring a part of my life into yours." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard to let go of everything everything that means so much to me. Sometimes, I feel like I've left pieces of myself behind just to fit into a life that has no room for me." Lawrence's face softened, a shadow of regret crossing his features. He sighed, leaning back in the chair. "I didn't realize it was this hard for you. I thought that maybe if you adjusted a bit, things would fall into place." Amelia smiled sadly. "Adjusting isn't the same as belonging, Lawrence. I don't want to just exist in the background. I want to be part of your life, to know my grandchildren, to share my stories and memories with them. Family it's about connection, not just proximity." Lawrence looked away, his jaw tightening. "I know, Mom. I know that in theory. But Sarah, she has her own way of handling things, and the kids, they're used to their routines. It's hard to shift that." He paused, a hint of sadness in his voice. "I didn't mean for you to feel like an outsider. Maybe I haven't done enough to make you feel welcome." Amelia reached out, touching his hand. "I'm not blaming you, Lawrence. I know life has its challenges, and I don't want to add to them. But I need you to see me, to see that I'm not just here to pass the time. I'm here because you're my son, because I love you, and because I want to feel close to you." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Lawrence seemed to understand the depth of her loneliness, the quiet pain she'd carried since she arrived. He squeezed her hand gently, nodding. "I'm sorry, Mom. I never wanted you to feel this way. I've just been so caught up in everything." Amelia's eyes softened, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sadness. "It's not too late, Lawrence. We can still find a way to bridge this gap. It doesn't have to be grand gestures or big changes, just small things. Time spent together, maybe family dinners where we can share stories, connect. I want my grandchildren to know who I am, and I want them to know you as well." Lawrence looked at her, a slight smile touching his lips. "You're right, Mom. I'll talk to Sarah. Maybe we can start having a weekly family dinner. Something that lets us come together as a family. I know that doesn't solve everything, but it's a start." Amelia nodded, her heart lifting. "That's all I want, Lawrence. A chance to be part of your lives, to be more than a guest." She squeezed his hand, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for listening." As Lawrence left her room that night, Amelia felt a faint glimmer of hope. The conversation had been difficult, but it felt like a step toward bridging the distance between them. For the first time since her arrival, she sensed the possibility of finding her place in this new world, a place where she could share her life, her love, and her memories with the family she cherished. And as she settled into bed, she found herself smiling, a sense of warmth settling over her as she looked forward to the changes that might come, however small they might be. In the days following her heartfelt conversation with Lawrence, Amelia began to notice subtle shifts within the household. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but small, meaningful changes that hinted at a new openness. Lawrence made more of an effort to spend time with her, sharing little moments here and there. A cup of coffee in the morning, a few minutes of conversation before he left for work. They were small gestures, but to Amelia, each one felt like a step toward the connection she had longed for. A week later, Lawrence and Sarah announced that they would be starting a new tradition: Sunday family dinners. They framed it as a way for everyone to reconnect amidst their busy schedules, and Amelia's heart swelled at the thought of finally sharing a meal where her presence felt fully acknowledged. She offered to prepare the meal herself, hoping to bring a taste of her old life into this new one. Much to her surprise, Sarah agreed, though with a slight hesitance that Amelia chose to overlook. When Sunday evening arrived, Amelia prepared one of her favorite dishes from home: fried chicken with seasoned greens, cornbread, and sweet potatoes. The smells wafted through the kitchen, bringing a warmth to the house that felt different from the usual sterile efficiency. Amelia hummed softly as she worked, the kitchen filled with the comforting sounds of sizzling and stirring, reminders of the life she once led. As they gathered around the dining table, there was an unfamiliar sense of unity in the air. Peter and Lucy, though initially reluctant, seemed intrigued by the food on their plates. Lawrence poured water for everyone, and Sarah, though visibly adjusting, offered Amelia a small, genuine smile as they sat down together. "So, Grandma," Peter asked between bites, "where'd you learn to cook like this? It's different from what we usually have, but it's good." Amelia's face lit up, surprised and touched by his interest. "Thank you, Peter. This recipe has been in our family for generations. My mother taught me when I was about your age." She chuckled, memories of her mother's kitchen filling her with warmth. "We didn't have much, but we knew how to make a good meal with what we had." Lucy, who had been quietly eating, looked up. "So, did you cook like this every day back then?" "Not every day," Amelia replied, smiling, "but Sundays were special. We would gather after church, and everyone would bring a dish. My sisters and I would spend hours cooking, talking, laughing. It was our way of coming together." Lawrence nodded, a nostalgic look crossing his face. "I remember those Sundays. The house was always full, and there was so much laughter." He glanced at Sarah, his eyes warm. "Mom's right. Family dinners were more than just food. They were the heart of our week." As Amelia continued sharing stories, a shift began to take place around the table. Sarah, who had often kept her guard up, seemed to relax as she listened, a look of curiosity softening her expression. She hadn't fully understood Amelia's life before, but hearing these stories brought a new perspective. She could see that Amelia's traditions were more than just old habits. They were symbols of love, connection, and resilience. Halfway through the meal, Sarah spoke up. "Amelia, I have to admit, I didn't understand how much these things meant to you. I thought it was just about having things a certain way, but I can see now it's so much more." She looked down, a hint of humility in her voice. "I'm sorry if I made you feel like there wasn't room for you here." Amelia reached out, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's. "Thank you, Sarah. I know I come from a different world, and it hasn't been easy for either of us. But I think we're both learning." Sarah nodded, her expression sincere. "We are. And I want the kids to know your stories too. They deserve to understand where they come from." A wave of relief and gratitude washed over Amelia. For the first time, she felt a true connection with Sarah, a bridge forming between their differences. It was a moment of understanding, a mutual recognition that they were both part of the same family, bound together not by blood alone, but by the shared commitment to love and support one another. As the evening wound down, the family lingered around the table, talking and laughing as they shared stories. Amelia felt a warmth settle over her, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since she'd first arrived. The small dining room, usually quiet and formal, was alive with the sounds of connection, its walls now echoing with laughter and familiarity. When the dishes were finally cleared and the last of the leftovers were packed away, Amelia found herself standing alone in the kitchen, a soft smile on her face. Lawrence joined her, giving her a gentle hug. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. "I think tonight was just what we needed." Amelia squeezed his hand, her heart full. "Thank you, Lawrence. It means more to me than you know." As she retired to her room that night, Amelia felt the weight of loneliness lift, replaced by a newfound sense of peace. She knew that her journey wasn't over and that challenges would still arise, but tonight had shown her that love, patience, and understanding could bridge even the widest gaps. She felt, at last, that she had found her place, not just in the house, but in the hearts of the family she loved. And as she drifted into sleep, she carried with her the hope that these moments would become the foundation of a new chapter, one defined by acceptance, shared traditions, and the timeless bond of family. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.